Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. I appreciate you being with me. We are continuing our examination now of Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35. I mean, commentator after commentator after commentator take it for granted that that Jesus in these verses is reiterating in very brief form what the apostles asked about in Matthew 24 and verse 33, verse 3, in which they said, in response to his statement that the temple was going to be destroyed, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? It is assumed without proof, that the apostles were asking about the destruction of material creation, and Jesus is coming at the end of time. That definition of your coming and the end of the age is assumed without proof. It is assumed without proof, by the way, that the apostles were so confused. They just could not imagine that temple being destroyed unless it was the end of time. That was John Calvin's view. Oh, by the way, let me make this announcement. Lord willing, in the very near future, within a month or so, I'll be introducing a brand spanking new book entitled, Were Jesus' Apostles Confused? It addresses this fundamental question and issue of Matthew 24 and verse 3. I'm telling you, 99.9% of commentators, whether they're amillennial, postmillennial, dispensational, it doesn't matter. They assume the apostles were confused. Now, there are isolated voices here and there who take note of the fact the apostles were not asking about the end of the Christian age. They were not asking about the end of the current age. They were not asking about the end of the physical creation. They were asking about the end of the age that the temple represented. And make no mistake, that Old Covenant temple represented the Old Covenant and that Old Covenant world. So, be looking for that book. Very excited about it. Just waiting on a few final things to get accomplished, but it's almost ready. All right? Be looking for it. Now then, it is argued then that in Matthew 24, verse 35, when Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass, but my words will never pass away. I hope that you'll go back and listen very carefully to what I had to say yesterday about the church and the gospel message never going out of business. Now, because you see, when we understand that the church and the preaching of the gospel never ceases, never goes out of business, never ceases to function, then it forces us to take the statement, heaven and earth shall pass away, in a totally different context. Because, after all, how are you going to affirm, on the one hand, the destruction of literal physical heaven and earth, and yet at the same time affirm the continuing preaching of the gospel for the salvation of men? Those two things don't work. And so, that's why we have the view that is held by all three futurist views. The gospel ceases to function. I asked Thomas Ice on one occasion, will there ever be a time in which the gospel ceases to function? He wrote back in an email and said, absolutely not. The gospel never ceases to function. Well, he didn't understand. He didn't see the train coming, obviously. Because once again, if the gospel never ceases to function, then guess what? There will never be a time in which evangelism stops. And that means heaven and earth is not literal, physical heaven and earth. Because, how are you going to evangelize if there is not life on earth? Unless you want to postulate the preaching of the gospel into all the stars or the planets or whatever. Point of fact is, Jesus' statement, my words will never pass away, are definitive. Now then, what then could Jesus have had in mind when he referred to heaven and earth? Well, one thing is for certain. The context of his discussion is the passing of the Old Covenant temple. Of that, there's absolutely no doubt, there's no speculation, there's no question. That's what prompted the questions by the apostles. And what absolutely must be understood is that in the ancient Hebraic biblical worldview, when you were discussing the passing of the entire social order, of a government, of a kingdom, even of individuals on a few instances, then the language of the passing of heaven and earth was utilized. And look, I've got to tell you, this came as a shock to me many, many years ago. Because as I viewed the language of Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35, I assumed that it was talking about literal physical heaven and earth. But of course, I kept running into verse 34. And that was problematic. And then I began to look at the Old Testament. I began to look at the prophetic language of the passing of heaven and earth. And oh, by the way, to go back to verses 29 to 31, something that jumped out at me, absolutely jumped out at me on many different occasions, was that in the commentaries that I was reading, the commentators, when they would discuss the language, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will be turned to blood, the stars of heaven shall be shaken, or not give their light, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And I read in these commentators, well, you see, this is typical prophetic language, for the passing of the social order, the destruction of a kingdom. So on the one hand, you've got the language of Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31, that many, many, many commentators, including amillennial and postmillennial commentators, and they say, oh, you see, that's metaphoric prophetic language. But then they come to verse 35 and they say, oh, well, wait a minute, passing of heaven and earth, that's literal physical passing of heaven and earth. Wait a minute. What's the difference between Matthew 24, 29 and 30 and Matthew 24, 35? What's the difference between the sun not giving its light, the moon being turned to blood, the stars of heaven falling from the sky, the powers of the heavens being shaken? Isn't that the destruction of heaven and earth? Well, if it is, then why isn't that verse 35? And therefore, if verse 29 to 31 is talking about the passing of the sun, the moon, and the stars, i.e. heaven and earth, in AD 70, as these amillennial and postmillennial commentators admit and teach, Kenneth Gentry teaches it, Gary DeMar teaches it, Joel McDermott teaches it, on and on. So once again, the question is, how do you take the language of Matthew chapter 24, 29 and 30 metaphorically as apocalyptic figurative language, hyperbolic language to describe the passing of the social order of a kingdom, a nation, and then come to verse 35, which is simply a succinct reiteration of verse 29 to 30, and insist that verse 35 is literal? Where's the hermeneutic for that? Well, when I began my study years and years ago, countless thousands of hours, I soon discovered that the Old Testament use this language of the passing of heaven and earth over and over and over again to describe events that are clearly now past. So I realized, oh, wait a minute. If the Old Testament used the language of the passing of heaven and earth to speak of events that I know are now past, then that demands, logically, that that language was being used metaphorically. So beginning tomorrow, I begin sharing some of those passages, not all of them, but I'll begin sharing some of those passages that discuss and predicted the passing of heaven and earth century upon century ago. And the prophecies concerning the nations that were being predicted against came true, and yet literal, physical heaven and earth did not pass away. And since Jesus was a good, faithful Jewish prophet, and in Matthew chapter 24, he is using the language of the Old Testament prophets to describe the fall of Jerusalem, then we have the right to ask, upon what basis does he shift gears from that discussion and use of metaphoric language, hyperbolic language, and then we come to verse 35, and all of a sudden, it's literal language. I believe that's an abuse of hermeneutic and exegesis. And by the way, if you want an in-depth discussion and study of the passing of heaven and earth as found in Scripture, get a copy of my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. It's on my website. Go there, go to the store, do a search for The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. If you order the book and say you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, I'll pay your shipping and save you $5. Okay, thank you so much for joining me on this Tuesday. I will see you on Wednesday, tomorrow, on the flip side, as we continue our investigation of the passing of heaven and earth. See you there.